Good afternoon, buenos dias, buenas tardes. I'm Aida Alvarez, and I have the honor of being a commissioner on the board of the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And on behalf of Betsy Brune, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, I want to give you all a very warm welcome to this wonderful occasion. Our program this afternoon and tomorrow will be very exciting, in fact, groundbreaking. Scholars from around the world will focus on the artistic intersection between the United States and Latin America over the last 2 centuries. Encuentros, Encounters, is timely and important for us at the museum and for the world at large. We are more interconnected than ever before. In fact, the Smithsonian's strategic plan revolves around 4 grand challenges. 2 of them are especially relevant today: valuing world cultures and understanding the American experience. This symposium speaks to both of these challenges. For their support, the Tera Foundation for American Art deserves a huge thank you. Mil gracias. In a few minutes, we will be hearing from President and CEO Elizabeth Glassman. Also here from the foundation are Amy Zink, Vice President, Carrie Haslett, Program Officer, Exhibitions and Academic Programs, Vera Thielsman, Head of International Academic Programs, and Peter John Brownlee, Associate Curator. I want to acknowledge symposium organizer Amelia Gerlitz. She's done a great job. Amelia is the Fellowship and Programs Coordinator for the museum. She's worked in partnership with Carmen Ramos, the museum's Latino art curator, and Virginia Mecklenburg, Senior Curator at the museum, who unfortunately couldn't join us today. For those who participated in this morning's tours, we are grateful to colleagues at the Library of Congress, the Art Museum of the Americas at the Organization of American States, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the Katzen Art Center at American University. And finally, thank you to the Smithsonian Latino Center, the Art Museum of the Americas, and Art Nexus for their efforts in publicizing this event. Please join me in giving them all a big round of applause and thank you. Encuentros is the 3rd of 5 Tera Symposia on American art in a global context, organized by the Smithsonian Art Museum, American Art Museum, with generous funding from the Tera Foundation. In 2006, the first Tera Symposium initiated a broad discussion of American art in a global context. In 2009, our East-West Symposium considered interchanges with Asia. We look forward to continuing this dialogue with 2 additional conferences in 2013 and 2015. The Tera Symposia reflect a global turn in art historical scholarship over the past 10 to 15 years. Scholars who once narrowly defined American art are now focusing attention on hemispheric, transnational, transatlantic, and Pacific studies. Attention is being paid to international trade and commerce, the circulation of objects, ideas, and artists around the world, and the role of diasporic communities in creating a visual culture here at home. To understand the American experience, we must take into account the country's long history of cultural, economic, and political exchange with more than 20 nations that make up Latin America. Further, Latinos have grown from 13 to 16% of the US population, making us the largest minority group in this country. With the recent appointment of Dr. Carmen Ramos as curator for Latino art, the museum is expanding and diversifying its Latino art collection for a major exhibition in the fall of 2013. The Smithsonian American Art Museum is also focusing its scholarship on the intersection of cultures. The fellowship program, which was established in 1970 under the late director Joshua Taylor, is doing all this work. The program has supported more than 380 research fellows over the past 40 years, More and more of our fellows are coming to us from other countries, Australia, France, Germany, Italy, Chile, to name just a few. We're extremely thankful for the Tera Foundation's support of these projects. For this symposium, Tera has made it possible to bring speakers from around the country as well as from Spain, Mexico, England, and Germany. It allowed many of them to bring their graduate students and junior colleagues to participate in this important exchange. Again, please give a thank you and a warm welcome to our next speaker, the President and CEO of the Tera Foundation, Elizabeth Glassman. Elizabeth.
Hello. These gatherings seem to come more and more quickly. So it seems like yesterday we were all here for the East-West conversation, and I'm especially pleased to be here again. And thank you very much for your good words, Commissioner Alvarez. And to represent, as you heard, all of the staff of the Tera Foundation that's come here. And I want to echo Commissioner Alvarez's congratulations to everyone at the Smithsonian who's helped put this together, and that we continue to appreciate all the work that you're doing, and we are very honored to be able to support some of it, including, you know, the Publishing Prize with American Art and other projects. As Commissioner Alvarez said, this is the third in a series of 5, at least this way it's planned now, symposia on American art in a global context. And each of these gatherings, we feel, has been a model for how to bring new perspectives and new conversations into our common dialogue about intersections of American art with other cultures. The series of symposia on American art in a global context mirrors many of the key goals of the Tera Foundation. That is, bringing international voices to conversations, understanding American art in relationship to other cultural and national cultural traditions, exploring themes of cross-cultural nature, and especially meeting people from around the world, and young scholars as well as working scholars who are involved in these studies. So these are a lot of hallmarks of some of the programs of the Tera Foundation. For those of you who might not be familiar with our organization, the Tera Foundation is a 30-year-old foundation with a mission to foster worldwide engagement with art of the United States made before 1980. Since 2005, we have been achieving our mission through our grants, our partnerships, and through exhibitions using our own collection, which exists based in Chicago of about 750 works. An example of pursuing the collection goals and presenting original works of art to audiences around the world, I'm pleased to announce that we are in the very early stages of organizing an exhibition in collaboration with colleagues at the Pinacoteca do Estado in São Paulo, Brazil, and with the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto, Canada. And this will be an exhibition that will take a hemispheric look at landscape painting across the Americas during the 19th and early 20th centuries, and will involve a team of curators from Canada, US, Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, and Peru, I think. But it's that kind of interrelational voices. Important too has been our commitment to make resources available worldwide, and to that end, we've worked with the Smithsonian Institution to support the Archives of American Art in a multi-million-dollar, multi-year grant to support digitization of this important scholarly resource. I hope it's been helpful to all of you all. And in the last 6 years, we've awarded over $40 million in grants for 370 projects in more than 30 countries. And it's been very gratifying for all of us to see the grant proposals increase every year. It makes it harder for us because we can only fund the same amount, But it's also very exciting for us to be able to put people in contact often, to be able to support projects in a variety of ways. And the result of this has been that we've seen the sort of quality and creativity of some of these projects has been more nuanced and more richly interpreted. All of us share a keen desire to unravel the traditional narratives of American art and to create new ones that actually explicate the complexity of situations that existed all the time. It's just that we weren't focused on those. I'm sure that each of you has an interesting project to support, so I really would encourage you all to talk to all of us who are here. That's why we all showed up en masse, so we could meet you. To look at our website, we have some new grant areas that might be of interest to you. There are travel fellowships for people from outside the United States who want to work on projects that need to come here and do research. We have scholarly resources in the areas like the archives, teaching fellowships that exist outside the U.S. and in the U.S. And most recently, we've opened up a publishing category. So there's nuances to that. Some of them are non-English texts being translated into English, and sometimes they're English texts being translated into other languages. So please look at our website. Please talk to us. Please introduce yourself. And if you happen to be traveling in Europe, please visit our resource center in Paris, where we have a very good library of American art. Now it's about 10,000 volumes, and we invite you all to view that on web as well. And I can't end without encouraging you to go down the street to the National Gallery of Art to see our painting, The Gallery of the Louvre by Samuel F.B. Morris, which is on view at the National Gallery for a year, along with a video that documents a recent restoration of that painting that we think is very interesting. So between talks, go enjoy the sunshine and travel down the street. And please introduce yourself to all of us who are here, and I really look forward to hearing what all of you have to say today. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Amelia Gerlitz, and I'd like to add my welcome to those extended so far. I would also like to thank Elizabeth Glassman of the Tera Foundation and Aida Alvarez for their presence here and their generous comments so far. As Aida mentioned, it is thanks to a generous grant from the Tera Foundation that this symposium, as well as the others in our series on American art in a global context, are made possible. In fact, it was back in 2006 when we had our first Tera Symposium that the concept for today's program began to take shape. For that conference, we invited Gabriel Perez Barrero, then curator of Latin American art at the Blanton Museum in Texas, to speak about the recent integration of their US and Latin American collections within the same galleries. This groundbreaking reinstallation, entitled Américas, hung artwork from various nations side by side, reconsidering the works within a hemispheric context. Flash forward several years, and we've seen hemispheric approaches to art historical inquiry increasingly gaining momentum. Last year, for example, the Newark Museum opened the exhibition Constructive Spirit, Abstract Art in South and North America, curated by Mary Kate O'Hare, who will be speaking later. This demonstrated the shared sensibilities and visual vocabularies of geometric abstract artists from both continents. Also in the past several years, a number of significant US exhibitions have taken a transnational approach to the artistic and cultural production of a particular city, movement, or artist. Among these are Nexus New York and Nueva York at El Museo del Barrio, curated by Deborah Cullen, Translating Revolution, U.S. artists interpret Mexican muralists at the National Museum of Mexican Art in Chicago, and Beyond Participation, Helio Oiticica and Neville D'Almeida in New York at Hunter College. Important scholarly catalogs have accompanied several of these shows and join a growing roster of publications with a hemispheric lens, such as the online Journal of Surrealism and the Americas. It is our hope that today's symposium will enrich and expand upon this burgeoning dialogue. In fall 2010, we issued a call for papers in order to gauge current scholarship on these issues and to bring in new research by emerging scholars. The timeliness of the topic was confirmed when we received more than 100 submissions. There were many wonderful papers that we were not able to include in today's program because of a desire for geographic and chronological breadth and new perspectives. In the end, the papers you'll hear today and tomorrow run from the late 19th century through the late 20th century and highlight artists and artworks representing the US and Puerto Rico, Chile, Colombia, Cuba, Mexico, Peru, and Venezuela, among others. We are thrilled to welcome participants from around the country and the world, and we also hope to reach many online viewers. And it is also my hope that this symposium will offer an unprecedented opportunity for a rich dialogue between scholars of US art and their Latin Americanist colleagues. We hope these discussions continue outside the auditorium, at coffee breaks and lunch, and perhaps beyond the symposium. Finally, I would like to thank my colleague, Carmen Ramos, for her invaluable help in shaping this program. Several distinguished advisors also generously shared their time and ideas over the past year. These include Smithsonian American Art Museum Senior Curator Virginia Mecklenburg, Edward Sullivan at the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU, Kathy Manthorne, Professor of Art of the Américas at CUNY Graduate Center, Deborah Cullen of El Museo del Barrio, and Gabriel Pérez Barrero, Director of the Colección Patricia Phelps de Cisneros. And lastly, I would like to thank Christine Hennessy and my colleagues in the museum's Research and Scholars Center, as well as the fellows, interns, and staff who have volunteered their time today to keep this event running smoothly. And now may I introduce Carmen Ramos, Curator for Latino Art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum.
Good afternoon, and welcome to Encuentros, our long-awaited international conference. I am Carmen Ramos, Associate Curator for Latino Art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and over the past year, I've had the distinct pleasure of working with Amelia Gerlitz, who has been the driving force behind this exciting program. I want to commend and thank her for her vision and intelligence that has made this conference the reality that it is today. Of all the global exchanges that could have been the focus of a conference, the encounter between artists of the United States and Latin America is among the most fertile and timely. Not only do the United States and the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean share a common history born out of Native American civilizations, European colonization, African slavery, and immigration, the relationship remains active with the increasing global nation of our world and the historic and ever-growing Latino populations of the United States that literally represent the coming together of two worlds. These experiences are uniquely American in the broad hemispheric sense of the word. In organizing Encuentros, the organizing committee sought to both gather the latest and the most exciting scholarship and consciously push the field in several directions. While it is commonly known that Mexican muralism strongly influenced the direction and tenor of the art of the United States during and after the Depression, we worked to bring together scholarship that considers new horizons before and after that pivotal moment in history. Over the next 2 days, scholars will offer new conceptual models for considering the exchange between artists of this hemisphere from the 19th century to the present. Rather than deploy the unidirectional notion of influence, these scholars have shifted to more dynamic concepts like participation, confluence, synergy, interaction, and integration. Papers offer new scholarship connecting the work of well-known artists from both regions, as well as bring to light lesser-known topics from Venezuela, Mexico, Colombia, and Peru. We also work to include topics beyond the modern era, focusing on Latin American émigré artists with long-standing roots or productive sojourns in the United States since the 1960s. As Associate Curator for Latino Art, I was also very insistent on including topics that are intimately related yet often more marginalized from both fields. papers devoted to the work of artists from the island of Puerto Rico, and Latino artists such as Ana Mendieta, Luis Jimenez, and David Botello, among others, work to complicate their positions vis-a-vis both the art of Latin America and the United States. And I want to end by acknowledging the presence of Freddie Rodriguez. Freddie, I don't know if you're there, you can stand up. The artist whose painting, Danza de Carnaval, is now part of our permanent collection and graces the cover of our conference brochure. Born in the Dominican Republic and raised in New York, Freddie absorbed the tenets of minimalism, which he often brought to bear on his bicultural and diasporic experiences in the United States. The painting is a perfect signpost for this conference and the exciting discoveries it will yield. And then just a few notes of housekeeping. In the interest of time, we'll be keeping introductions to a few sentences. Each of you should have received a packet of speaker biographies, which are also available online. Following each group of talks, we hope to have some time for Q&A. That said, we look forward to a more in-depth dialogue at the end of the day when Professor Michelle Greet will moderate our closing discussion. Also, please note that we're webcasting these talks and they will be archived for future viewing on our website. And lastly, please turn off your cell phones or put them on vibrate. So without further ado, let the conference begin. Thank you.
I'd like to welcome our first speaker. Katherine Manthorne is Professor of Art History at the Graduate Center at City University of New York. She focuses on the hemispheric dimension of American art, beginning with her doctoral dissertation at Columbia University, her early exhibition, Creation and Renewal, Views of Cotopaxi by Frederick Edwin Church, and her first book, Tropical Renaissance, North American Artists Exploring Latin America, 1839 to 1879. Further projects include contributions to Nexus, New York, fern hunting among these picturesque mountains, Frederick Edwin Church in Jamaica, and Nueva York, 1613 to 1945.
Well, thank you. I'd like to just second my appreciation of the folks that have been mentioned, and especially Amelia, who has been just absolutely fantastic in terms of all the organization. Of course, the Tera for their support, and the Smithsonian American Art Museum, which has been such a great supporter of these issues. My paper today, Ambas America, interrogates the intellectual and geographic boundaries of the encounters across the Americas during the 19th century. And I think as we're congratulating ourselves that we're taking an increasingly transnational turn, of course this is rather intimidating. And so I think all of us have a lot to absorb from the papers that we hear over the next couple of days, which will offer successful alternative paradigms. My primary goal here is to utilize the transnational studies to reiterate America's connectedness, but I'm especially concerned with a kind of chronological window that I'd just like to mention. Our Encuentros program, which is indicative of some of the best scholarship in the field, is, as you gaze across the program, largely focused on the 20th century with only minimal representation of the earlier periods. And since, of course, the 19th century was the era when many of these political and cultural relationships between the Americas was first established, it is, of course, important to include them in the future. So let's begin with the late colonial era, when new trans-American artistic conversations, such as you see here, opened up between John Singleton Copley in Boston and Rafael Jimenez Planas in Mexico City. Or we can extend it to the 20th century, where folks like Armando Reveron were working outside Caracas, living among his dolls, and you can see his self-portrait there. And you can actually compare him, I think, fruitfully to New York's Luis Alchemius, who does these dream landscapes. Both considered outsiders within their own national schools, I think they take on nuance when we look at them together. So what I'd like to do in my talk is to spread a broad net and to map a series of chronological moments and historic themes where there's a close dialogue between the art of Ambas Americas. With these and subsequent trans-American pairs, I'm less concerned with the idea of influence, as we've already mentioned, but instead I want to focus on affinity, defined in Webster's dictionary as a kind of similarity of structure, as of species of language, implying a common origin. And I will also at times look at parallels devoid of mutual roots. So beginning in the colonial centers of Philadelphia and Lima, Peru, my first model here highlights the affinities and parallels in portraiture. So we see here on the right the itinerant portrait painter William Williams, who did this image of Deborah Hall dressed in her luxurious gown, standing in a fanciful garden, the symbol, of course, of her father's wealth and her own feminine attributes. Far away in Lima, Doña Mariana is depicted with similar visual strategies, although the unidentified artist amends it with the colonial convention of the cartouche bearing the text. The Brooklyn Museum's longtime pairing of these two portraits in their American Identities installation, I think, assures us that increasingly museums are beginning to mine their collections to make these associations across the Americas. Given that the nation's invention of a tradition is revealing of its ideology, discovery stories provide an important nexus across the Americas. The U.S. at times seems to treat Christopher Columbus and his so-called discovery of the New World as its exclusive province. But of course, it is a multinational story, as borne out by the art, such as the Mexican painter's Obregon's dream of Columbus. The U.S.-based, German-born Emanuel Leutze painted the subject numbers of times, including his well-known Columbus Before the Queen. And I think his picture bears comparison with the work of the Mexican-born Juan Cordero, whose Columbus Before the Catholic Monarchs was the first work with an American theme to be seen by the Mexican public when it was shown at the Academy of San Carlos in 1851. And you can see they sort of resemble each other in overall concept and detail, with one interesting exception. Among the finds, among the finds that you see in the Mexican picture is a group of semi-clad native peoples who stand among the rather overdressed Europeans. And this, they're showing off their gold armbands. So the artist's decision then to include them was rooted in the discussion over race and nationhood conducted in the Mexico of the artist's day. The presentation of Indians and Europeans in Cordero's picture anticipates the birth of La Raza, the single race born out of the mix of Spanish, Indian, and African blood. And this pictorial divergence relates even to the contrasting observations of that fateful day, October 12th. While in the United States, it continues to be referred to as Columbus Day long after the man and his myth had been debunked. In Mexico, it's called the Day of La Raza. So it signifies the reference not of the discoverer or the conqueror, however you want to term him, but rather the existence of a new hybrid race of mestizaki. This juxtaposition represents another twist on the myth of discovery and conquest. John Vanderlin's landing of Columbus in the U.S. capital compared with the work of the Brazilian Mariellas. He depicts the celebration of the first Mass in Brazil with the Portuguese explorer Pedro Álvares Cabral in attendance with his own men, mixed in with the indigenous peoples. So this was an act that claimed the lands for Portugal just as surely as Columbus established the domain for Spain when he planted the flag on American soil. But I'm showing it because it raises, of course, another kind of thorny issue in terms of the religious difference across the hemisphere, that we have the challenge of comparative analysis between Latin America with its colonial Catholic past and the United States with its Anglo-Protestant roots. Grand manner portraiture was accessed across the hemisphere to celebrate the leaders of independence. And here in the center, I'm just showing you one example of the French artist Charbord's Napoleon, which was the equestrian prototype for both Selly's rendering of George Washington and the Venezuelan artist Tovar's portrait of Bolivar, the liberator of South America. So clearly more research is needed into the frequency and treatment of these themes and public reception across the hemisphere. The propagation of nationalism in official art is, of course, directly related to academic training. And here I'm just showing you Mexico City's long-established Art Academy of San Carlos. This should be compared to other curricula in the Americas, including that of the National Academy of Design in New York, with respect to their encouragement of and training in history painting, as well as, of course, many other matters. And the Tera's great Gallery of the Louvre, which you heard we should all go and see at the National Gallery, again, just to remind ourselves that, in a way, such places as the Louvre provide the kind of common storehouse of the Western pictorial tradition from which the artists globally could draw. So naturally, these sources in themselves suggest certain overlaps. But we also, I think, need to acknowledge that the Americas boasted a robust tradition of self-taught, primitive, and folk artists. So I'm just showing you two watercolors of married couples in interiors. One's from Medellin, Colombia, and the other from New England, which again demonstrate the primitive stamp on artistic production that manifests another aspect of these affinities. But given that the landscape tradition has often been considered a touchstone of national identity in the US, it's useful, I think, to analyze that concept in a little bit more depth. Scenes here, as you can see, by the Mexican Jose Maria Velasco offers a dynamic counterpoint to the New York-based Frederick Church. Both artists sought a means of representing landscape more vast than that of Europe, and one that resisted the conventions of the picturesque, as exemplified by these volcanoes. Velasco studied under Eugenio Landesio, whose training in Rome led him to revere Claude, and was then brought to Mexico City in 1855 to become the instructor of landscape painting at the Academy of San Carlos. Church, of course, was the pupil of Thomas Cole, who felt such an artistic kinship with Claude that he rented the studio said to belong to the 17th century master, and certainly passed on his interest in that tradition to his pupil, Frederick Church. But while the volcanic terrain and watery abyss that you look at here seem initially to be a disparate formal pair, I just wanted to discuss them in terms of a firm grounding in a shared aesthetic that can be read on a transnational as well as a national level. Velasco was, we could probably say, obsessed with the Valley of Mexico. He painted it over and over, home of the capital city from the ancient times until today. And he incorporated a subtle iconography into his pictures to tell its story. According to legend, in 1325, the wandering Mexica people established their settlement at the spot where an eagle landed on a cactus. And here you can see in the foreground of Velasco's picture, here in this area, that same motif. He also includes a roadway that linked the various locations in the ancient mythology as well. So it looks like a natural road or a natural cactus, but has these other meanings. Sometimes we recognize those elements, but we overlook the picture's global component. In 1519, when the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés made his famous march from coastal Veracruz to Mexico City in the Central Plateau, he paused at Cholula. And there he had to choose from one of four possible routes to cover the last 15 miles. And he chose the most difficult between the mountains, which he also realized would be the most unexpected. And here, as you look at this image by Velasco, but again, to remind ourselves that this continues through history, and this incorporation is important, that during the U.S. invasion of Mexico 3 centuries later, then U.S. Army Captain U.S. Grant attacked Mexico City via the same pass of Cortés. So thus, Velasco knowingly inscribes multiple phases of human history through the natural history. And similar claims, I think, can be made for Church's large canvas. Of course, we all know there's much ink spilled over Niagara, but there hasn't been as much attempt, I don't think, to discuss it transnationally. And Church, I think, conceived Niagara in a way that allows us to do that, because he has started thinking about it after his first trip to South America that he made in 1853, and then where he had seen and painted the Andean falls of Tequendama. Then he comes back, he exhibits Niagara on the eve of his departure for a second trip to Ecuador in 1857. So with Niagara and the southern continent on his mind, he must have pondered the associations that Niagara held for Latin Americans. Widely circulating Latin American poems and essays treated Niagara as a symbol of U.S. aggression against their homeland. Probably the most widely admired was the Cuban Jose Maria Hereda's poem Niagara, translated actually by William Cullen Bryant. So the poem took on the standard Anglo-Teutonic sublime and overlaid it with a kind of Caribbean comparison of the hurricane, thus Americanizing it. And add to this the fact that the falls themselves straddle the border between the US and Canada, and that Church's vantage point was Table Rock on the Canadian side, and we begin to recognize that the artists and the pictures across the hemisphere from Canada through the United States to Mexico all deserve perhaps to have another reading. Gaucho, cowboy, huaso, vaquero, llanero. The terms across the Americas are different, but the man they denote was essentially the same. Cowboys were defined by the task they performed. They worked cattle on horseback. So for these free-ranging cattlemen, they equated freedom with liberty with freedom from restraint. Thus, their preferred habitat was the dividing line between civilization and wilderness, what we call the frontier. So narrating U.S. history, the western frontier has assumed huge proportions, I think, in our tellings, and again, assumed a kind of U.S. exceptionalism. But as Alistair Hennessy and others have discussed, Frontiers, plural, are significant as well in Latin American history. So it's therefore not surprising when the Uruguayan Juan Manuel Blanes took up the subject of his native gauchos, his images bear more than a superficial resemblance to their counterparts in the North American West. So these pictures of prairie topography and frontier types remain important elements in the national mythologies of both North and South. And this carried over also into the literature, where we find the Argentine intellectual and leader Domingo Sarmiento writing in 1845 about the terrible power and immensity of their pampas. Searching for the words to describe the flat, open terrain of his own country, he turned to James Fenimore Cooper's novel of the 1820s, The Prairie. There, Sarmiento found passages that so closely matched his native landscape that he was convinced that Cooper must have been writing about Argentina. He then went on to claim that these, what he called the analogies in the earth, produce analogous customs in the people, which to him explained the parallels in their frontier types. Blanes' static figures looming large against the low horizon find analogies in Western art of the 1840s and 50s, when the frontier was the domain of trappers and traders. So here I'm just showing you comparisons between William Ranney and Blanes to round out that comparison, these similar strategies of isolating the figure from civilization by heightening their physical and psychological remoteness in these prairie scapes. And their prominence also conveys, I think, their courage and respect. For we have to keep in mind that really these figures were only began to be mythologized as they were disappearing from the view, from history. North and South America faced the challenge of territorial space and its conquest. The cowboy was one agent of change, and of course the railroad was another. Leo Marx wrote of the machine in the garden, or the intrusion of technology into nature as it evolved in the US. But we now need to fold into that discussion of related railroad construction and modernization from Mexico to Argentina. Compare, for example, Innes's canonical pictures to Velasco's locomotive steaming toward the viewer, an icon of both technological promise and threat. The plantation is a distinctive New World institution, and as such offers the Americanist an invaluable object of study. First created in the 16th century, they came to connote an estate in a tropical or semi-tropical region cultivated by the workers who lived on it. The 19th century witnessed the birth of the modern plantation, which became increasingly large agro-complexes, which enabled more and more efficient delivery of crops such as cotton, which depicted here by William Walker, an itinerant artist who traveled all over the southern United States and made a specialty of the cotton plantation. And of course, harvesting coffee, photographed by Muybridge in the coffee plantations of Guatemala. And there's actually a very nice portfolio of Muybridge's images of this trip in SAM. Sugar plantations flourished on the backs of slaves transported from Africa via the triangle trade in the American South and the Caribbean, as well as Brazil and elsewhere. So this again offers another comparative opportunity. Sugar was to the 18th and 19th century what oil is to us today. It started out as a great luxury and it ended up as an absolutely necessary commodity that draws the Atlantic world into precarious relations. So this is the subject of my current research, and actually the course that I'll be teaching as the Tera Professor of American Art at Berlin. My goal is to explore the artistic production and art patronage driven by the sugar trade and manufacture. And I'm finding that at every phase, from the slave working in the field to the consumption of the sweet treats, we're all tracked in both the popular and the fine art. Similarly, the large fortunes amassed from this highly lucrative trade were invested in collections that today have completely been disconnected from their nefarious roots. And here I'm just showing you, consider this one example, these two portraits of the sugar plantations. On the left, by the Louisiana artist trained in France, Marie-Adrienne Persac, and on the right in Puerto Rico by the native painter Francisco Oyer. So their pairing raises many issues, but I'll just confine myself to three. My first point is that, of course, many of us look at the New York-based artists, the Hudson River School in the 19th century and so on, but we fail to look across the country, and so one of my arguments is just to look at the American South, because places like New Orleans, of course, were polyglot ports, which had a huge trade with the Caribbean, as New York did. Second, of course, the plantations themselves bear more than a superficial resemblance, because especially the Creoles in Louisiana modeled their plantations after those in the Caribbean. And so these are two important points. And the third, that they're both, of course, painted at moments of incredible historic strife. Persac after the Civil War, and Oyer around the time of the Spanish-American War, which I think you'll be hearing more of from Edward Sullivan. So to conclude then, these artworks bespeak a moment in which the two traditions, the US and Latin America, converged. Diego Rivera painted a Pan-American mural in 1940 at another moment of historic convergence, of course, at the time that the Good Neighbor policy was being put into effect. So we don't want to ignore the political goings-on, too, that overlay with the artists. So these artists are all picturing their societies at a point of incredible kind of moments in their individual histories, but also in global history, with witness to industrialization, urbanization, immigration, and concomitant threats to the natural wonderland that define the New World. So it's not my intention to deny the national ideologies that separate us. Of course, that would be futile to do so. But we can, I think, gain fresh perspectives by not only looking across the hemisphere, but reminding ourselves that the 19th century was an important moment, too. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Deborah Cullen, Director of Curatorial Programs at El Museo del Barrio in New York City, where she joined in 1997. She will serve as the next Chief Curator of the Triennial Poligráfica de San Juan. Her recent exhibits include Nexus New York, Latin American Artists in the Modern Metropolis, and the internationally traveling Arte y Vida, Actions by Artists in the Americas, for which she received an Emily Hall Tremaine Exhibition Award in 2006. Other projects include the retrospective, Retroactive, the work of Rafael Ferrer, and Ferrer's forthcoming monograph. Cullen was a fellow at the Center for Curatorial Leadership, and has forthcoming essays on ASCO and performance art in Latin America. Cullen serves on the board of the Association of Art Museum Curators, the Institute of Cultural Inquiry, and the Robert Blackburn Printmaking Workshop. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'd like to echo all the thanks to Amelia and Carmen, the Smithsonian, and the Tera Foundation. Since the early 20th century, Caribbean, Latino, and Latin American artists have been creating and participating in what I have come to think of as contact zones, workshops or spaces in which artists hailing from diverse homelands could dialogue and collaborate. These contact zones are at home in U.S. urban centers, particularly New York. Their history is intertwined with the larger histories of modern art, and metropolitan exchanges often reverberate significantly, leading to important international developments. However, with the exception of a few off-cited figures, the spaces as such have been essentially understudied, while the character and contributions of the leader artists hailing from the Caribbean and Latin America have long been overshadowed. With the muting of these distinctive voices within modernism's lively artistic dialogues, we have failed to recognize that in part their collaborative spirit and generosity through their spaces, welcoming and nurturing, has itself been a key element. I'll only have time here to mention related publications and mural works, and won't have time to analyze the productions per se of any particular space, but for a few cursory comments. But rather, I'd like to focus on a dense net of human connections that I think we would all be the poorer without. We are going to keep coming back to these spaces over and over again the next 2 days, and I'm convinced that they are integral to our study of cross-pollination. I'd like to outline what I've been picturing as a hive of early interconnected contact zones by sketching out the links between them. In broad strokes, I will trace these interrelated endeavors, the key players, and the character of each site, all of which were fermenting in the years between 1935 and about 1950. I believe the importance of these early contact zones is witnessed by the explosion of kindred organizations modeled upon them and developed in the 60s and 70s. And I would even go so far as to propose that these foundational models foreground the multitude of artist collaborative groups that we see springing up throughout the Americas today. These are ideas I began shaping with the exhibition I curated for El Museo del Barrio entitled Nexus New York, Latin American Artists in the Modern Metropolis, generously funded by the Tera Foundation, and which I have been further developing for my forthcoming project for the Instituto de Cultura Puertorriqueña, the 2012 installation of the Trienal Poligráfica de San Juan, which we've nicknamed The Hive, or El Panal, which focuses on Caribbean and Latin American printmaking workshops and collaborative ventures from 1915 to the present. As part of the New Deal, Franklin Delano Roosevelt ordered work relief to assuage the effects of the Great Depression. In 1935, the WPA sanctioned the Federal Art Program, which had divisions for the various disciplines. The Graphic Arts Division ran from 1935 to 1940. In New York, it was based in a Midtown Manhattan studio. The WPA's Graphic Division can be credited with reviving lithography, silkscreen, and block printing in the United States in the 20th century. The WPA also placed print studios in community centers in various neighborhoods around New York and in different cities altogether. And the WPA's largest New York community center for the arts was in Harlem. Gwendolyn Bennett and Augusta Savage conceptualized the Harlem Community Arts Center, a complete and separate WPA art workshop, and Savage was appointed its first director. The HCAC offered easel painting, sculpture, mural programs, a children's program, and a printmaking facility, and was launched at 290 Lenox near 125th Street in 1937. After a little over a year, Bennett reported that 73,000 visitors had attended the various activities or registered for classes. Artist and historian Vertus Hayes, who himself had trained with Jean Charlot in Mexico, noted that the HCAC was the first site in American history to make accessible the technical expertise and equipment necessary for printmaking to the New York Black community at large. Quote, "Too often he is forced to leave his own community for lack of facilities in art training or any art opportunities," he wrote. By making printmaking available at home, there was a sudden surge in graphic experimentation by diverse artists who had not been able to work in the medium before. And by specifically locating a print workshop in Harlem, rather than centralizing all printmaking at the Midtown studio, the uptown artists were able to more freely explore and hold spirited discussions that may have been muted under a more heterogeneous and intimidating circumstance. As well, artists connected to the larger community of writers, musicians, and philosophers. Luminaries such as Eleanor Roosevelt, Albert Einstein, and Paul Robeson visited. Charles Alston, Jacob Lawrence, and Richard Wright hung out there. Aside from Savage and Bennett, the faculty at the HCAC included the Czech-American modernist Václav Vyčísl. I always say his name wrong, sorry. The lines between teaching and learning were blurred, as often the teachers were studying the processes for the first time on equipment they had never had access to previously, just steps ahead of their students. In 1938, young high school students Robert Blackburn and Ronald Joseph learned lithography with the Jewish-American Russian artist Riva Helfont. The three forged a close alliance. Why am I discussing Harlem in depth in this conversation? Because although the Harlem Renaissance is often thought of as a homogeneous movement, it was in fact a very nuanced group that included a large and particularly creative population of West Indian artists. Many of the key artists among those touched by the HCAC were Afro-Caribbean, born in the West Indies or first-generation diaspora. Norman Lewis's parents were from Bermuda. Ronald Joseph was born in St. Kitts, lived in Dominica, and moved to the United States when he was 10. Ernest Critchlow's father was from Barbados, and Robert Blackburn was born to Jamaican parents who met on the last boat leaving Montego Bay for the United States just prior to World War I in 1914. Generally speaking, the West Indians were interested in education, liberal and radical politics, and in moving up the socioeconomic ladder. They were ambitious, thrifty, and had strong business acumen. Slavery had separated many African American families, creating matriarchal and unique family situations, whereas West Indian families were more traditional and intact. The majority of African Americans in Harlem at the time were either Baptist or Methodist, whereas West Indians were predominantly Roman Catholic or Episcopalian. These differences sometimes led to frictions. West Indians were often considered straight-laced and stern, and their business success was at times resented. However, the strong contribution of the West Indian artists, Robert Blackburn in particular, to whom we shall return, is what interests me here. The WPA HCAC's impact on the young Blackburn and his West Caribbean counterparts was significant and would have ramification. Later, we shall hear more about the resonances of the WPA in the Caribbean itself, in Puerto Rico. But where did the idea for the WPA and its workshops come from? The WPA concept itself was based on a model set forth by a Mexican artistic union, whose manifesto was drafted by David Alfaro Siqueiros. Most artists in the time at the US, including our Harlem-based artists, were aware of and enamored by American scene painting and muralismo from Mexico. It is broadly known that the Tres Grandes all painted murals in the US in the early 1930s. However, a particularly important but less heralded Mexican artist, Luis Arenal, had been intricately involved stateside earlier. Arenal originally ventured to Los Angeles between 1923 and 1926. He returned in 1929 to study at the University of Arizona. In 1930, he began to paint and exhibit in California, and by 1932, he was living in Los Angeles when Siqueiros arrived there after being expelled from Mexico. In Los Angeles, Siqueiros taught at the most important art school and painted 3 murals. He gathered American disciples around him called the Block of Painters, young men who wanted to discuss and experiment with Siqueiros' ideals, artists who were interested in experimental, committed, and collaborative art. These included Arenal, the young Americans Philip Guston, Reuben Kadish, Sanford McCoy, Jackson Pollock's older brother, Harold Lehman, Murray Hantman, and many others. For a group exhibit slated in 1932, the block took the exploitation of labor by capital and the harsh treatment of the Negro in America as their themes. In a shed on Arenal's property, block members each created 6-foot portable frescoes with iconographies drawn from the liberal imageries of the time. The evening before the opening, the Los Angeles Red Squad broke into the gallery and shot out the eyes and genitals of certain frescoes and smashed others with the butts of their gun. The next day, the artists found their works in rubble. According to Harold Lehman's daughter, the artists tried to sue the police, but the trial judge was hostile and concluded that the painters themselves may have destroyed their own work for the publicity. The case was thrown out, and the Los Angeles block soon dispersed. Arenal returned to Mexico. Siqueiros was forced out of the US and went to Uruguay and Argentina. He too returned to Mexico in 1935 when he was able to. In the meanwhile, 2 of his acolytes, Reuben Kadish and Philip Guston, wrote to Siqueiros to find an interesting project south of the border for them. With the poet Jules Langsner, they bought a $23 car and drove to Mexico City, where a huge wall in Morelia, in the former summer palace of the Emperor Maximilian, had been designated. Between August 34 and January 35, they produced this mural. Scholars such as Alan Landau have noted that their own Jewish heritage instigated them to pursue this topic, even after their bad Los Angeles experience. Guston and Kadish then traveled onward to New York, where their old block buddies, Jackson Pollock and Harold Lehman, were already living. In 1936, Siqueiros, along with Arenal and the Bolivian Roberto Bordesio, returned to New York. There, Siqueiros gathered again many of his Los Angeles collaborators, including his linchpins, Luis Arenal, whose sister Angelica would marry Siqueiros in New York, Lehman, and Pollock, as well as Pollock's brothers Sandy McCoy, Roberto Bordesio, Antonio Pujol and Jose Gutierrez, Clara Mall, and many others. Siqueiros established the Siqueiros Experimental Workshop, a laboratory for modern techniques on West 14th Street, to have a common space to create individual works, as well as experimental large-scale projects using modern technologies. The new processes and approaches culled from big industry and included mechanical means. Hurling, dripping, splattering, stenciling, all were fair game. Siqueiros called this kind of work controlled accidents. Siqueiros worked in partnership with his materials, flowing thinner over paint to form rivulets and, I quote, the most fantastic weird patterns, Harold Lehman recalled. Many of his images started the same way, with automatic dissolving of paint from which he would then pick out the images and develop them. That wasn't just one of Siqueiros' techniques, it was the technique, end quote. Oh. At the experimental workshop, they produced individual works as well as public posters, murals, and other commissioned projects, including floats and propaganda pieces. These painted portraits were commissioned by the Communist Party. You could see them there. You can also see the other painting in the background. This one, the birth of fascism. The workshop painted the portraits for the Communist Party and then had them photographically reproduced for large-scale use at the June 1936 election rally in New York. Many of the experimental workshop artists were also simultaneously working with the WPA. Guston joined the mural project and executed works for the New York World's Fair in '39 and the Queensbridge Housing Project in '40. Luis Arenal was somehow also able to carry out a WPA mural. Here we see him working on his paintings in the stairwells of Bellevue Hospital in New York in 1936. While the workshop had a short, proper lifespan, Siqueiros had left the city in January 1937 to set off for the Spanish Civil War. Projects were carried out in the workshop's name until late 1938. Roberto Bradesio, ably assisted by Dominican artist Tito Enrique Canepa, painted these now lost murals for the Communist Party Workers' Bookshop on 14th Street in the name of the experimental workshop. Two portraits of New York include images of Tom Mooney and the Scottsboro Boys in a prison emerging from the New York Stock Exchange, oppressed by Nazi-like swastikas. Arenal also left New York in 1937, returning again to Mexico. There he founded El Taller de Gráfica Popular, the TGP, with Leopoldo Mendez and Pablo O'Higgins. The TGP's printmaking collaborative boasted over a dozen core members and flourished in the late 1930s and 40s. And they sought to make clear, message-oriented black and white graphics promoting the revolutionary ideals. Certainly, Arenal's involvement in the Block of Painters, the experimental workshop, and the WPA informed his vision, returning the inspiration to Mexico. We will be eager to learn more about U.S. artists and the TGP later on in the conference. TGP included many members of the government-sponsored League of Revolutionary Artists and Writers, many of whom also participated in its publication program, Frente a Frente, which you can see an example here. The TGP aesthetic was in part foreshadowed by the political and social satire found in prints of the turn-of-the-century artist José Guadalupe Posada, as well as the 1920 artist groups, such as the Estudiantismo Circle and Treinta a Treinta, which also had a zine-style magazine, which you can see some images there. Despite Siqueiros and Arenal's departure, in New York there were still sites fostering experimental abstract techniques and providing welcoming forums for the convening of international perspectives. One of these was the New School. Ecuadorian artist Camilo Egas, pictured here, was hired by the New School in 1932, and by 1935 until 1964, when he died, he was the first director of the school's art program. He facilitated the participation of many artists, and many of whom served as faculty and lecturers from around the world. Michel Griet's book certainly is a wonderful source for more information on that. Egas painted this mural for the New School alongside mural cycles by Thomas Hart Benton and Jose Clemente Orozco, as the school intended to be international in scope while signaling all its attentions to all of the Americas through these choices. Stanley William Hayter relocated his intaglio workshop, Atelier 17, to the New School when he relocated it from Paris in 1940 as hostilities in Europe rose, and we will learn much more about this later on too. In brief, many influential European artists, particularly the Surrealists, were fleeing the increasingly unsafe conditions in Europe. The bright side of this difficult geopolitical displacement was that Americans met Europeans and mingled as artists for the first time. Louise Bourgeois, Max Ernst, Maria Martins, Mata, and many others exchanged ideas with emerging American artists, including Pollock, Dorothy Daner, John Farren, Louise Nevelson, and Anne Ryan. The New School itself was active in promoting Surrealist ideals. In 1941, they hosted a series of lectures by Gordon Onslow Ford on automatism, and at one of his lectures, Robert Motherwell and William Baziotis met Mata. Mata then formed a brief-lived group, including those, and Peter Busa and Jerome Komrowski and others, where they discussed the potential of automatism. Automatism, an experimental method that allows the subconscious to generate images, became popular in part through Siqueiros, whose kindred idea was the happy accident. Hayter's automatism was done with the plate and burin. Automatism allowed the art process to reveal its subjects and to excavate and explore deeply ingrained archetypes and myths. The abstract expressionist seized upon these surrealist methods. While Hayter insisted that his students practice in this method, which sometimes resulted in a look that detractors of his method note, he was a force in keeping American printmaking from the social message work often associated with the WPA and keeping it resonant with the concepts that preoccupied the most vital rising painters of the time. Hayter himself has remarked on the importance of the ambience of his workshop in the American context. Many of them met one another at my workshop because the situation in New York, well, they were howling in the wilderness, and they were having a very tough time of it. They were working in the most squalid of lofts on East 10th Street, down in that neighborhood. There was no place to easily get together where they could meet one another. During its 10 years in New York, Hayter's studio was another important point of contact. Hayter's fresh emphasis on the experimental nature of intaglio resonated just a few blocks away, where Robert Blackburn, who had studied at the HCAC, as we heard earlier, founded his own groundbreaking litho studio. Blackburn's workshop, which still operates today on West 39th Street, is the oldest continually operating collaborative print shop in the United States and is a testament to his foundational experience at the HCAC. After the HCAC, Blackburn studied at the Art Students League. There, his most important teachers were Vit Lichil again and Will Barnett, the League's official printer. Blackburn worked with him on Saturdays, printing pieces for Raphael Sawyer and Orozco. With Barnett, Blackburn continued his education on the possibilities of printmaking, expanding knowledge he had gleaned with Riva Helfont. He even approached George C. Miller, the leading black and white artist lithographer, to ask for technical information. Miller said to him, "Young man, if you want to learn anything from me, you'll have to spend $100 a week, and then I'll teach you something." In October of 1947, Blackburn moved to West 17th Street. He was living and working in a large loft with 4 other artists, including Harry Hone, a colleague from high school and a printmaker from Atelier 17. Blackburn had procured 1 lithographic press and initiated what would become known as the printmaking workshop in his living room. He held open classes 3 nights a week, printing editions for other artists and allowing students and friends to experiment directly on the press. Printers like Miller liked to keep their trade secrets from the artists. After the close of the WPA facilities, if artists weren't affiliated to a school or had a gallery to pay a printer for them, they had no access. A complex group of West Indian, African American, Latino, and liberal white Jewish artists gathered at Bob's. Print expert Sylvan Cole noted how difficult it was for artists to experiment in graphics. And I quote, "Miller, for example, didn't like the artists to use tush, and he didn't like them to use razor blades or things like that because it cut into the stone, and that stone was really important to him. When it came to grinding the stone down, if there were cuts in there, he had to grind it lower, and then it used the stone up faster. So Miller was an absolutely difficult person to do any experimental work with. He wanted just a traditional crayon lithograph." However, Will Barnett has recalled the special circumstances of Bob's shop. At Bob's shop, there was always an opportunity to work in all different kinds of ways in handling the stone, Barnett has said. Barnett himself produced a series of 17 stone color lithographs at Bob's that would be considered groundbreaking. By 1950, Blackburn's workshop was flourishing. He moved it out of his apartment into a 23rd Street loft where he set up 4 presses. Tom Laidman has written about the early days. And Tom is actually the tall one in the photo. Bob's the one with the glasses. "There was no elevator. Everything in the place went upstairs on our backs, including presses, stones, lumber for building, coal for the stove. We froze in the winter, roasted in the summer, and the heat didn't make the printing any easier. We went through all kinds of maneuvers to keep the images in the stone from filling in. The atmosphere was intimate. There was an open arrangement. Students and artists had unlimited access. Blackburn himself was a dynamo of energy. He never walked, he trotted. He bound up the 4 flights and hit the landing on the run. He lifted and grained stones, rolled them up, and printed them all day. And then he'd work on his own prints at night. Sometimes I'd watch him work. I don't remember ever seeing any preliminary sketches. He'd go right to the stone, draw on it, etch it up, roll it up, and print it. Then he'd draw on another stone, print that over the first one, and evaluate. He always had 5 or 6 blank stones while he was working. He used them like paintbrushes. He was a tremendous artist. In 1950, when Hayter returned to Paris, Blackburn wooed the wayward engravers by installing an Italio press. Although Blackburn did not officially study with Hayter, he often visited and had become very friendly with everyone working there. PMW operated as Bob's private atelier until 1971, when it was formally established as a not-for-profit. Blackburn, the dynamic Jamaican American, served as its leader for 56 years, inviting thousands of international artists to make prints. In his time, Blackburn paid particular attention to what he called were minority artists, Black, Latino, Asian, and Native, and is crediting with seeding the idea for workshops from El Barrio to Namibia. But perhaps the best place to leave off this overview is to note that Blackburn, while running PMW, also worked for money as the first master printer at Titania Grossman's Universal Limited Art Editions, ULAE, in Long Island, producing from 1957 to 1963 the first 79 editions. While printing for Rauschenberg, Johns, Dines, Frankenthaler, Motherwell, Hartigan, and many others, Blackburn infused the so-called graphics boom of the early 1960s with his own approach to printmaking in color, and most particularly with his enthusiasm for diverse points of view and collaborative exchange. But in the volumes produced about the seminal ULAE workshop, Blackburn is hardly mentioned, but the Jamaican-American artist's influence on ULAE's production has never been truly analyzed, despite the fact that his own experimental color lithography was already 20 years advanced when he was hired, much prior to the litho explosion that he was instrumental in instigating. The PMW is a wonderful example of the many collaborative ventures which were instigated in the 30s, consolidated in the 1970s as not-for-profit organizations, and which can be seen as a link between these WPA or TGP ideals and the proliferation of what I think is the contemporary collaborative artist workspace. Often the brainchildren of artists, they are well aware of historical precedents and the needs of a new generation. Sometimes this revolves around issues and technical information of a different sort than last century, but still involves conversation, collaboration, communication, and contact. In closing, I might suggest that some of these new contact zones in the Americas include hard-to-categorize sites such as Soma in Mexico, Lugar a Dudas in Cali, Pera Local in San Juan, Catedral de Arte Conducta in Havana, Espira Espora in Managua, CIA in Buenos Aires, and many, many others. I'm urging that we focus our art historical vision and consider the importance of these local workshops or zones of encounter that had international reverberations. Even in our increasingly plugged-in and virtual world, artists need and enjoy coming together in real life and rubbing up against each other. When they do, things happen. We just need to pay careful attention to their meetings to note the sparks that later ignite. Thank you.
Carmen Ramos is Associate Curator for Latino Art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Previously, she was Assistant Curator for Cultural Engagement at the Newark Museum in New Jersey and an independent curator. At the Newark Museum, Dr. Ramos organized the exhibitions The Caribbean Abroad, Latino Artists and Migration in 2003, America's Pastimes, Portraits of the Dominican Dream, Works by Freddy Rodriguez in 2005, and A Mexican Museum of Modern Art, a project by Franco Mondini Ruiz in 2007, among others. She served as co-curator for El Museo del Barrio's 2007 biennial, The S-Files, an ongoing exhibition series that presents the latest contemporary art created by Latino, Caribbean, and Latin American artists currently working in the greater New York area. Please welcome Carmen.
Hello again. In November 1968, a group of 6 Mexican-American artists, including Felipe Reyes and Jesse Almazan, organized an exhibition in San Antonio titled Americana Theme, Phase 1, Cowboys. In using terms like Americana and cowboy, their exhibition concept at once emphasized the regional and national dimension of their effort. This U.S. national focus, undertaken by artists who would later form one of the first Chicano groups in the United States, was not an isolated incident. Fast forward to 1990, when the historic survey exhibition Cara, Chicano Art, Resistance, and Affirmation was once again emphasized the ties between Chicano art and the art of the United States. The catalog notes, quote, "Chicano art remains a vital and aesthetic force, and Chicano artists continue to pose questions concerning the role and direction of the art of the United States and the Americas. They challenge and redefine the hemispheric and national parameters of American art. In this manner, Chicano art affirms its value and place in the national arts," end quote. This resounding quest to place Chicano, and by extension Latino art, within the umbrella of the art of the United States remains a rare phenomena, relegated to the scholarship of a small group of scholars and curators, many of whom are with us here today. This predicament undoubtedly relates to the historical roots of these categories. As an outgrowth of the civil rights movement in states across the Southwest and the East Coast, Latino artists from various ethnic and racialized communities with deep roots in the United States would express oppositional identities and give image to the culture and history of communities marked by social erasure. During its formative years, Latino art would encompass a range of forms and modes, from politically charged murals and posters presented in public space to subversive performances. This, of course, is only part of the story. Not only did some Latino artists work outside of the civil rights discourse, the category of Latino art could also mean more than a hyphenated identity. While early terms like Chicano, Nuyorican, and eventually Cuban American and Dominican York affirm hybrid cultural experiences, they also contest narrow definitions of American identity. In this way, the category of Latino art relates to the efforts to transform the exclusionary practices of American museums in the 20th century and beyond. If, as this 1970s protester notes, Black and Puerto Rican art must be represented, then the category of Latino art names that absence of representation. As associate curator for Latino art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, this decades-long push to transform narrow conceptions of American art are foremost on my mind. How can we best present Latino art in all of its manifestations in the national context that is the Smithsonian? And now that Latino artists have a dedicated professional focused on their production, where do we go from here? In this presentation, I argue for an approach that does not deny the transnational ties between Latino art and Latin American art and culture. Rather, it calls attention to the other half of the equation. If Latino art has at least 2 cultural and historical tributaries coming from the North and South, then the American Art Museum should be poised to tell the North American part of the story. In doing so, I seek to consciously avoid the pitfalls of a multicultural approach of celebrating diversity by adding a few names to the canonical narrative. What is required is the messier and more challenging task of meaningful integration. Where do the mutually constructed fields of Latino and American art overlap, digress, or even disappear? And how does simultaneously engaging works of American artists, regardless of ethnicity or race, ultimately change how we think of American art, history, and culture? By weaving inside and out of the mutually constructed categories of American and Latino art, I offer some early observations as I work to construct a more dynamic picture of the art of the United States. In this effort, I'm inevitably drawn to the mid-20th century, a period that witnessed competing definitions of American art and the rise of Latino art. On the one hand, critics like Clement Greenberg and historians like Irvin Sandler would celebrate the rise of formalist abstraction. For them, the triumph of American painting lay not in representing the national scene with particularly recognizable imagery, as had done artists like Thomas Hart Benton in the 1930s and 40s, but in transcending the local to embrace the universal. Yet by the end of the 1950s and into the 60s, abstraction would be challenged by a range of movements and tendencies, from pop art to happenings and beyond, that not only returned to representation, but deeply engaged the systemic shifts ushered by the social and political movements of the post-war era. This camp dealt with the stuff of everyday life in the United States, from the rise of consumer and mass media culture, as seen in the work of Andy Warhol, to Cold War politics, as explored by James Rosenquist. The national dimension of pop art in particular was not lost on artists and critics writing at the time. Art historian and critic Robert Rosenblum, for example, established a direct line between pop artists from the 1960s to what he called predecessors, artists such as Charles Demuth, Joseph Stella, Stuart Davis, and Gerald Murphy, who engaged early 20th century popular culture in the name of founding in American art. Yet unlike these forerunners, pop artists did not set out to create national symbols, but rather to critically reflect on the national scene. To be clear, Latino artists participated in both camps. Working well before the category of Latino art was established, painters such as Carmen Herrera and Olga Albizu produced abstract works in keeping with their times. Cuban-born Herrera moved to the United States in 1939, and after a transformative sojourn in Paris, returned to the United States to become a participant in the New York avant-garde. Her cerebral geometric abstractions, marked by bold, angular forms piercing through space, would anticipate the later developments of hard-edge minimalism and op art. Puerto Rican-born Olga Albizu, alternatively, first embraced abstraction on the island, and then continued during her studies in New York and Paris in the 1940s and 50s. Her thickly impastoed and gestural canvases, such as this joyful one titled 950-80 Yellow, reveals her training under her German-American teacher, Hans Hofmann. Latino artists also found a place in the movements that challenged mid-century abstraction. For reasons of time, I want to shift my attention to pop art as a key movement that offered Latino artists, especially those politicized by the civil rights and anti-war movements, an entry onto the national stage. Pop holds a special place for many reasons, not only because, as Tomás Ibra Fausto and Holly Sanchez Barnett have either intimated or argued, it challenged the divide between high and low cultures and thereby paralleled the aesthetic sensibilities of vernacular cultures, of vernacular traditions in working class and bicultural communities. But, as I hope to show, pop harbored a critical historical consciousness that allowed even some of its major figures to dive into polemical contemporary history, including civil rights. For example, between 1962 and 1963, James Rosenquist painted this large-scale work that addressed the African-American civil rights movement. The title, Painting for the American Negro, suggests that Rosenquist set out not to represent Black people per se, but offer them his interpretation of the current state of affairs. Rosenquist juxtaposes the signs of middle-class status, from a car to an adoring housewife and her children, alongside truncated images that suggest racial oppression and stereotypes. On the top right, a businessman steps on the head of a Black man. And throughout, Rosenquist peppers the work with signs of interracial contact, from a horse that evokes the racial category of mulatto to a chocolate and vanilla cake, possibly a kind of pre-Oreo reference denoting an assimilated Black person, or to the active legs of Black and white basketball players. While these references are open to interpretation, the ways in which Rosenquist deliberately obscures Black faces suggest that despite the movement for equal rights, African Americans were not seen as individuals. In a similar civil rights vein, Andy Warhol produced a body of works inspired by photographs of the 1963 civil rights demonstrations in Birmingham, Alabama, published in Life magazine. Through his appropriation and transformation of these media-derived photographs, Warhol offered a biting commentary about the political state of his country. In Little Race Riot seen here, Warhol repeated the same image of racial violence, shading each in the colors of the American flag, as if to confront the viewer with a disturbing picture of the United States. I argue that it is works like these that open the door to Latino artists who sought to both engage politics and participate in the aesthetic mode of their day. I want to focus my remaining comments on the late Luis Jimenez, seen here in front of his sculpture, Vaquero, which stands in front of this building. I do so not only because the artist self-described himself as a quote-unquote post-pop artist, but also because Jimenez was literally part of the East Coast pop scene. In the mid-1960s, just a few years after his arrival in New York from his native Texas, Jimenez forcibly introduced himself to Ivan Karp, the famed co-director of the Leo Castelli Gallery, who had helped launch the careers of Andy Warhol, Klaus Oldenburg, and many others. Karp helped Jimenez secure his first gallery, and by 1971, Jimenez would join Karp's own gallery, OK Harris. It was during this period when Jimenez was represented by Karp that his work was selected for the 1973 Whitney Biennial, along with that of established pop artists like Roy Lichtenstein. Jimenez's early works clearly fit into the classic contours of the pop movement. In 1964, Robert Rosenblum narrowly defined pop art based on its, quote, coincidence of style and subject, or works that represent mass-produced objects and images by using a style which is based in mass production, end quote. As a sculptor, Jimenez was attracted to what he called industrial materials, such as plastic and fiberglass, related to contemporary commodities, from Tupperware to muscle cars. And like his pop art peers, Jimenez's works critically engaged advertising and media culture. His 1967 American Dream, for example, explored how car advertising tapped into male desires for power, sex, and leisure. The work also signals Jimenez's rising racial critique through the language of pop. When compared to Jimenez's other female representations, like his paper dolls from 1970, we see that the artist was acutely aware of skin color, here depicting three women of different hues, white, black, and olive tone. Works such as these convey that Jimenez intentionally portrayed the grotesque woman in American Dream white. In this case, the title American Dream suggests that media culture not only fueled immigrant hopes for middle-class status, but for whiteness as well. The series Death Mass, alternatively, appears to take off on Jimenez's exposure to news photographs of the riots during the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago. While Jimenez used fiberglass, a medium appropriate for a sculptor, Death Masks shares much with Andy Warhol's painting Little Race Riot. Both works are informed by media images, which each artist transformed into an aesthetic object destined for a gallery setting. It was, however, with the 1969 sculpture Man on Fire, an important transitional work, that Jimenez begins to significantly alter the pop art mold from a particularly Chicano or Latino perspective. I say this not because this is one of the first works that overtly reveals the influence of Mexican history and muralism, especially José Clemente Orozco's mural Man of Fire, located in Guadalajara. Rather, with Man on Fire, Jimenez's historical lens begins to shift between the past and the present. The work was in part inspired by the media coverage of the Vietnamese monk who set himself on fire in protest of the Vietnam War, which for Jimenez reverberated with the rise of anti-war sentiment in many Chicano communities. In fact, early studies for the sculpture show that Jimenez initially envisioned the figure in a seated position, mirroring the widely publicized photo. Second, the work was inspired by the racial unrest Jimenez witnessed when he worked as a social worker in New York. Jimenez was taken by rioting Black and Puerto Rican youth, throwing Molotov cocktails, a scene he would later capture in this drawing. This standing, partially unclothed, and deeply brown figure would inform the final sculpture. And finally, Jimenez also noted that the sculpture's profile was meant as a self-portrait. and was further inspired by the Pontiac Indian head hood ornament Jimenez remembered from his father's car. In conjuring this noble Native American icon from US popular culture and merging it with his own likeness, Jimenez begins to shift his approach to pop art. Undoubtedly, this association relates to the then burgeoning discourse of Chicano indigenism, which asserted the indigenous identity of Mexican Americans and established the community's roots in the historic Southwest, in lands that were formerly part of the Mexican state and its pre-conquest cultures. Yet in contrast to his contemporaries like Yolanda Lopez, whose classic image, Who's the Illegal Immigrant Pilgrim, portrays a contemporary Chicano donning Aztec-inspired regalia, Jimenez's indigenous iconography is squarely taken from US popular culture. In so doing, Jimenez digs up the specter of the conquest and US Western expansion, two projects that found representation in art history through the iconic image of the Indian, as in this 1850 sculpture by Ferdinand Petrick, created in the midst of the Indian Wars that accompanied the US push toward the Pacific Rim. This conceptual link between Chicanos and US Native American cultures was affirmed by other Latino artists working before and after Jimenez. In the late 1950s, Rafael Montañez Ortiz created recycled films such as Cowboy and Indian, based on Anthony Mann's classic Hollywood Western, Winchester 73 from 1950. In an effort to quote-unquote redeem the indigenous womb, Ortiz spliced and then reconstructed copies of the film, destroying its logic and narrative. More recently, Delilah Montoya's landscape photographs taken on the border that cuts through a Native American reservation in Arizona questions not only the divisions between the nation-states of the United States and Mexico, but the Tejano Native American nation as well. Like these and other Latino artists, Jimenez tampered with Western narratives, activating Native American images in the present. It is this deep historical consciousness that would continue to inform Jimenez's works for the remainder of his career. In works such as Vaquero, where the artist recast the American cowboy to reveal its Mexican roots, Jimenez would move beyond contemporary references to tap into the archive of American art and history. Such classicized allusions would conceal Jimenez's pop roots for those unwilling to dig deeper. In placing Jimenez's works alongside that of other American artists, I have sought to highlight not only his active participation in pop art, from which he remains excluded in both past and present accounts, but to show how his work opens up a different reading of the movement and its legacy. While pop is often discussed in relation to contemporary history, or how it explored the ways in which, quote, consumerism changed the appearance of the world, to quote Hal Foster, the movement begins to take a different course when a socially marginalized artist steps into a movement with national connotations. Like his pop art peers, Jimenez's early works affirm that consumer culture signifies meaning beyond its surface. Yet it also asks, what does it signify and for whom? Similar to the work of Betty Saar, which departs from racialized American popular culture, Jimenez turns stereotype on its head to open up a dark chapter in our national history. Viewed from this perspective, Jimenez emerges not as an ethnic outsider embroiled in an intergroup conversation about identity, but as a key participant that inflects the national in a whole new way. Thank you.
If our speakers so far could come have a seat at the table, and we'll bring up the house lights. We have some time for discussion before our break. There are microphones on either side. It would be great if you could speak into a microphone so that the webcast will pick it up. Questions? Do you all have any questions for each other? Further thoughts?
I know. I have a question.
Yes, over here, Karen.
I'm assuming it's on, yeah. Yeah. I want to thank the panelists for that very stimulating introduction to a two-day symposium. My first is an observation. You'll hear the one sentence I get to put into my paper tomorrow for Deborah Cullen. Judy Baca went down to Taller Siqueiros and studied with Luis Arenal. I didn't know if you had that in your contact zones of contact across the Americas.
In a larger version, yes, there would be a lot.
Okay,
The web gets much more
tell me.
complicated.
Then tell me the web. I'd love to hear it. If you could just share just a little bit more than how they related.
I don't have all my information
okay.
with me, but that's part of what I'm looking at for the Trienal Poligráfica de San Juan, is sort of the back and forth of their of those interactions.
Yeah, because I had understood that other Chicano artists went to the Taller Siqueiros, but I have only heard like 3 names so far. So I'm hoping you'll be able to uncover that. Or
I can pull up some information and send it to you. I'm sorry, I'm just like blanking
Yeah.
on it right in the
That's
moment.
good.
But
and then I also had a question for Dr. Ramos. I really enjoyed the way you helped us nuance in a new way understandings of integration and a challenge to the American dialogue on who belongs in this nation. And I was hoping you could share just a little bit more about that very first slide that went by so quickly.
Americana theme phase
Yes.
1 Cowboys.
Yes, thank you.
I wish I had more to say. The image comes from Rubén Cordova's book on Consafo, which is the group that was eventually formed after that exhibition. And I don't have a lot of documentation as to what was exhibited there. He doesn't reproduce works that were exhibited in that exhibition. So I'm not sure how much more I could provide, but the concept is just fascinating, you know, and I wanted to sort of emphasize this kind of attraction to these concepts and these themes that are so American, you know. I mean, what's more American than a cowboy, right? And even some of their language, this notion of Americana was also used by other pop artists, like Robert Indiana, for example, used that term as well. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I don't know enough about that. It was a very interesting exhibition concept that was very rich.
Did someone have a question down here? Oh, yes. Feel free to speak loudly and I can repeat.
I have a question for Kathy Manthorne. I was very interested in, of course, your comparisons, for example, insofar as landscape is concerned, Velasco and Hudson River School artists, and it made me, it reminded me of a very interesting exhibition that was done at Corcoran, I think about 10 years ago, on Australian and North American landscape in the 19th century. So the question that I have is, are you positing more direct links between the American and Latin American artists, or are you talking more about a spirit of the times that has a manifestation in various Western traditions?
I think that's a good question. I mean, the show that they did, Elizabeth Johns was involved, and several other people looking at the Australian, which was interesting. I think it was called New Worlds from Old or something like that. Was it? Can anyone help me? But anyway, but I do what I was trying to sort of set up in my talk, and I think could be expanded, is just the whole idea of first of all, certain moments in history when these confluences become more likely to occur. You know, that there are certain conditions in different countries that allow them to sort of converge. the most typical example is, of course, U.S. during the Depression, when there is a much more interest in what the Mexican painters were doing. I mean, that's the most common example. But as I was trying to emphasize in different comparisons, that there are these moments when things come together more closely, and moments when it would be sort of absurd to try to compare them to any great degree. So I think that show with Australia and the New World was trying to argue that there are certain sort of factors about exploration and settlement, and also even British colonial areas, things like that, that were common to all these different places, that allowed us to find certain kinds of connections and parallels. But my own conviction is really that there are conditions in the Americas that allow us to find things that are even more specific than just those general kinds of feelings about or tendencies in landscape. So for example, when you look at Velasco and Church, I mean, I couldn't go into it in that much depth there, but the whole idea of Velasco being extremely interested in natural history. He does the murals for the Natural History Museum. He's very engaged with the whole idea of the geological kind of concept of time, as is Frederick Church. He has, very strong library filled with materials that fed his interest. They both have mutual roots in Humboldt. You could go even further. Velasco's work was shown in the United States at the Centennial in '76, and he actually comes to the United States and goes to Chicago at the 1893 Centennial. So the more you look, the more you start finding all these different levels of engagement that they shared. And so, I think it's a matter of degree that, I'm not discounting the Australian or other kinds of connections, but I do feel strongly that there are a lot of mutual roots within the Americas tradition that allow us to find, a very kind of special relationship in the art.
And may I just ask the second part of it?
Please.
Your work on the sugar plantations, which is of great interest to me, because of my interest in Molière. I'd be very interested to know if you could talk a bit more about the synergies between photography and painting in many realms, but particularly with the development of representations of sugar plantations, some of which are active and prosperous. Others, in the case of Molière, are finished with their work and are melancholic. Is there a photographic link, do you think?
Thank you for bringing that up. That's another important aspect of this. And in fact, I mean, you can even, I guess we shouldn't admit this, but if you do your research on eBay and places like that, you can find stereographs, for example, of lots of places all over the Americas, the Caribbean, but even Peru, Mexico, places that you don't necessarily think of as having these sugar plantations, because they weren't so much part of the international trade, but they developed the sugar for their internal consumption. And so I think photography would be another whole level of tracing these elements, because of course areas that may not necessarily have even an itinerant painter like Walker, or some have the good fortune to have Oyer as your family friend and hanging out at your plantation, you could still perhaps have a photograph made of these areas. And so I mean, I do think that's another whole sort of layer of this project that I wasn't able to really explore, but it's certainly a key aspect. And even in terms of the Spanish-American War, of course, and that you could even go into film. That's another thing that I wanted to bring in, but it just got too big. But even early film developed some of this with the Spanish-American War, and then early studies of labor. There are images of the plantation, so it's continuous, and it's really just beginning to unravel these threads.
Yes, over here in the back. You. Yes. Okay. Sorry, can't see too well.
Thank you. So just to pile on, this is also a question for Kathy Manthorne, but thank you for your talk. And as I was thinking about the other questioners' comments and that great quote from Sarmiento about the Pampas, it strikes me that what we're lacking is maybe some of those just rich connections that we saw in the other two talks, where there are just so many links. And I wonder if you could comment on the possibility of using a historicized account of vision or perception, which you've already sort of addressed with photography and film, as ways to link not just the affinity between the paintings, but the historical conditions producing them.
So your question is, can you use photography to develop the historic context, or film? Or?
The question is, can you use a historicized account of vision and maybe the imagination to think about ways that these artists are linked rather than just the sort of contact model.
Right. I mean, I would just brought up one or two places where things obviously diverge. You're not going to find a one-to-one match. I mean, even in terms of, as I mentioned, the religious aspect of it, you know, that if one tradition is more rooted in Catholic and indigenous beliefs of one type and another is the Anglo-Protestant tradition, I mean, that obviously those things are going to diverge. Language diverges, and of course, ideas of vision diverge as well, because, you know, again, that was one of the reasons that I just sort of, as a kind of coda, included things like the Academy of San Carlos and the National Academy of Design in New York, because, you know, again, what's taught there, how are people taught to see? You know, the Academy of San Carlos is the oldest continuous school in the Americas. I mean, we tend to think in the United States that the National Academy, you know, had a leg up, but in fact, things were going along quite well long before that. And so what was being taught there? I mean, Velasco had the good luck to have somebody teach him landscape painting. That didn't exist in New York in the comparable period. So how are people being taught to see what kinds of, you know, strategies are available, as you say, these different conditions? I mean, those are all things that need to be layered on there. I kind of felt, since I was one of the first talks, that I guess all of us kind of had this idea of spreading a bit of a broader net, and other things would be developed in other talks. But I appreciate your comments. It's very useful.
I see a hand over here.
My question is rather simple. You go further back in the 19th century, and I ask because, as you know, the travelers, particularly the European travelers in the 18th century, emphasized the exotic and the contrast between the tropics, the Pampas, and the Andean region. I've seen reproductions and some isolated commentary about American travelers in South America, and particularly in the Andean region. George Squire comes to mind, which does not necessarily focus on the exotic or on the archaeological. Do you think that's a field worth exploring?
I'm sorry, the end of your question trailed off.
Do you think that's a field worth exploring, or were they just too few, too isolated, the number of 19th century visitors to Latin America, which recorded not just in writing, but in drawings and engravings?
No, I think it's absolutely worth exploring. I think we're just beginning to, you know, it's just the tip of the iceberg that we're currently aware of and currently including in our scholarship. And I think more and more, you know, different bodies of work are being discovered, either bodies of images or by a single artist, I mean, or different kinds of manuscripts and materials that relate travel, you know, experiences of travel diaries, those kinds of things. And the more we excavate the archives and other kinds, even families are turning up these materials now more and more because of the internet. I mean, as we all know, people are contacting us about things that their great-great-grandmother wrote about, you know, when they were traveling. So, I mean, I think all these things are incredibly important to include, and that ultimately I think we will get away from this idea of the exotic, or, you know, these categories that we now have, which are, you know, very crude. I mean, the whole idea of the devil is the whole idea of labels of the Dickens. You know, I mean, it's hard to label things. It's hard to make generalizations, and the ones we have now are just really approximations, and we need to refine those much more. So, I mean, I really think, you know, places that are beginning to serve as databases for larger bodies of visual material, textual material, these are absolutely critical looking across the Americas. And so I hope that we continue to collect those things.
I know the Library of Congress, for example, has a very good collection of drawings and prints of 19th and 18th, well, it's early 17th, but 19th and 18th century travelers in Latin America. And I was wondering if that's a good place to start, or do you have any other suggestions?
Well, I mean, a lot of the travelers to the Spanish-speaking countries would have to have been Spanish, or you know, because there weren't many others allowed to be there, right? Brazil, of course, there would be a different group of people. But I mean, places like the Museum of the Americas in Madrid, I would think the archives in Madrid would be a good place to start. I would think, I mean, maybe people in the audience here have suggestions, but those places are kind of rich resources that I don't think have been mined as fully as they could. Those are just two that come off the top of my head. But well, I mean, places like the British Museum too. They have, you know, they just tend to have any large repository, the Library of Congress, the New York Public Library. The more you dig into these places, the more you discover they have things that you never dreamed were present in those collections. So I think, we can all be more mindful of finding these things and sharing them with each other.
Over here. Passing the microphone, one moment. Over in the back one.
Yes, for Katherine Manthorne, I'm very interested in this hemispheric kind of paradigm that you've laid out for us, and I'm wondering if that paradigm would be inclusive of, in any way, of Canada, because I'm thinking of, the landscape with the group of seven, maybe some of the Quebecois post-war abstract expressionists. You think of indigenous images of indigenous Native Americans, across the hemisphere, right? So I mean, there's another place where you can look at, say, like Emily Carr or somebody like that. So I'm just curious about how that would work.
Well, you're absolutely right. We're all guilty of that. We probably all should have either acknowledged that we don't know anything about Canada, or that we were just leaving it out for lack of time.
I will acknowledge Kathy was the one who said to me, "What about Canada? You have to include Canada."
And actually, there is a student that works with me here from the Graduate Center, Eva Gratu, sitting right here, who is actually going to include Canada in her dissertation, I'm very happy to say. But joking aside, though, I mean, of course, it is very important to include those issues as well. There was a great one exhibition catalog that I always point to that included, looked at 3 women. I mean, Emily Carr, as you mentioned, then Georgia O'Keeffe and Frida Kahlo. And I always pointed that as a good model for that, for that kind of thing of looking at individuals. But part of the problem is just the accessibility of all the scholarship. And a few times I have actually tried to do sessions or conferences where I included Canadians, and I even beat the door down, writing to people, don't you know anybody who's working on this? And out of 30 or 40 proposals, I think I ended up with one by a Canadian or about Canada. So I mean, it's something that we need to work on. But I don't think it's for lack of trying on our part. So.
Hi, I'd just like to address the Canadian aspect. As a Canadian scholar of American art, we were talking, Kathy, you were mentioning some great archival resources, and I would encourage people to apply for the National Gallery of Canada Fellowship Program. And I was lucky to spend a very snowy January during a bus strike looking at military topographic drawings of Canada from the 18th century. And from some of you who will remember that wonderful show at the Corcoran, I don't know if it's 30 years ago now or 20 years ago, but a lot of those Canadian military topographic artists were included. And of course, this tradition of landscape comes out not only of the picturesque, but of the military topographic and the mapping influence. And there's huge collection there of artists like Davies and Sandby and other military-trained British artists who spent much of their time in Canada. So it goes way back before the group of 7. So there's the Canada issue. And the one other thing I wanted to say is, now that I'm a Philadelphian, let's not forget about the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, which was founded only about 15 years after Academy San Carlos. And I'm particularly interested in comparing history painting of the Academy San Carlos and the Pennsylvania Academy in the 1840s and 50s, because you mentioned Vanderlyn and Leutze, but of course Rothermel and Schusela were the great teachers of history painting in this period. So, one day I'm going to apply to the Tera Foundation to do a show on this. And Kathy, I hope you're still interested in it and that we can keep talking about this. So,
you want to pass the mic in front of you?
Should I wait for an answer?
Oh, go for it.
Oh, this is a different question. This question is actually for Deborah, Cullen, and for Carmen Ramos. I'm very interested in the way that both of you talked about contact zones, even though one of you use the term, but I think a lot of what you talked about was really contact zones. And I'm an urban planner, so I come from a very different perspective. And what I'm interested in is, to what extent do you think urbanity and urban space was important to enabling these kinds of contact zones to happen in art? And I really would love to hear from both of you.
I mean, for my part, my research has focused on mostly New York and right now some other urban centers in Latin America and the Caribbean. So I think the urban zone is really very important. Of course, I always feel, guilty for leaving out, in my case, the printmaking workshops that happen in other places as well. I mean, it's a whole different model in a way, like the retreat sort of workshop, I think. But I think the ferment of the urban space where people were able to come and pass through very quickly on a fellowship, during travel or what have you, especially early in the 20th century, which is where I'm kind of focusing right now, was extremely important, as well as for the diversity of mix of persons that you could encounter in a smaller place that might be more difficult to do in a more regional way.
I think since my paper was just focused on Jimenez, I think it's interesting that work developed there, and that, like other Chicano artists and artists from other places of his generation, they were all attracted to New York. I mean, you could read our, the archived oral histories here at the Archives of American Art, and it's ongoing. Oh yeah, we had to go. Artists in the 50s, we had to go to New York, and and he was, one of a number of artists that were lured by the city, and that, his Man on Fire. Who knew that, Mr. Man on Fire was Black and Puerto Rican, right? Yeah. No one knew. Not many people, but that it was based on this kind of contact with a much larger, community, and I think that. We were actually having a conversation, because I myself am originally, from New York, and, how do people identify? Even Freddie Rodriguez has, we've talked at great length about how he primarily identifies himself as a New York painter, as a New York artist. So I think this notion of urbanity, of this very local identity, is very important to a lot of artists who are from bicultural communities, because they tend to really identify with where they're from, not necessarily where their parents are from or where they were born and lived for very few years, but really where they're from, where they live their lives. So I think it's a very interesting idea, and the urban space is very important.
I just want to make the point that, there's different New Yorks too. I mean, we think of it as this one city and everyone's a part of it, but I did my dissertation on Bob Blackburn, if you all can't tell. So one of the points that I make there is how important it was for the Harlem Community Arts Center to be in Harlem, for the artists to have that experience there and be emboldened in their own space, when at a time where Bob and Jacob Lawrence and some of the other artists talked about how intimidating it was to go downtown, that they didn't do it. Or they just went once to see a show at the Met or something because they really wanted to. Bob talks about taking the subway to go to the aquarium in Brooklyn, but he wouldn't go downtown Manhattan. And so when he actually moved in 1947, I don't know if that was like lost on the general audience, but when he moved to Chelsea in 1947, that was huge for him. And he insisted on staying there. So there are different New Yorks based on, the social, racial, economic politics of the time. And that's a really interesting and nuanced thing that we should look at in terms of where these spaces are. A number of the spaces were on 14th Street or on Union Square. That's really interesting too in terms of the politics of Union Square. So,
we have time for one more question. I see a hand in the back.
Thank you. Well, actually, I just, as a curator in American history, Smithsonian, I've been here 21 years. I just want to congratulate this museum for finally opening the doors to Latino art in a more serious way, other than just posting paintings on the wall by themselves. So looking at the complexity of Latino art and Latin American art, it's something that needed to happen a long time ago. And so I'm glad Carmen is here now. It's able to open the door. In terms of contact zones or urbanity, I do music more than art. But I think in terms of the aesthetics, in terms of urbanity, in terms of the way we think about these issues, it's similar. We forget, I think, many times that people live very close to each other. And in the example, for example, of salsa music, which is very much urban New York music, there's African Americans who are part of it. There's people from all over different places, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, Cubans, but there are also a lot of Jews because they were neighbors, because they went to the same schools, and they influenced each other. So you get this conglomeration or conglomerate of different styles and things that come together to form something. And then individually, then all those people also form other things on their own that was connected to that. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I think art probably works in similar ways, and we forget that. And Carmen, the point you were making about pop art, I think it's a great one, because we never think of people like Luis Jimenez in terms of pop art, and people think of Liechtenstein, and people think of other Warhol, obvious people, but they never think of Latin American artists as having been influenced by that or being part of that movement. And I think it's because of the cultural logics that we have in the US, in the way we think about groups, the way we think about our racial practices, and the way we think about ethnicity, and all of that influences, I think, the way we look at the products of people in general, whether it be paintings, art, music, etc. And, but, again, thank you for having this conference and opening the doors to this.
Thank you.